Hello, my name is Jade DaCosta, and I'm a creative writer, avid reader, and knowledge mobilizer with a PhD in sociology. And this is a book review of Yellowface by R.F. Kuang or Rebecca Kuang. So something I've realized about myself is that I really enjoy books with unreliable narrators, and particularly unreliable narrators that are driven by their ego, driven by their own sense of self-importance, driven by their own need to be a victim, who really aggrandize their existence and how much space they're occupying in people's brains and minds. And I really appreciate when this technique is used to highlight how perception is manufactured systemically, structurally, or just based on someone's own position and their beliefs. And Yellowface is a book that does this not only in a really captivating and interesting way, but intentionally and critically, and to get at the influence of white supremacy, and particularly the white gaze, in storytelling, in the literary industry, in history, actually, in the sharing of history and memories and stories of the past within the present. So Yellowface is about two characters, the narrator, who is named June or Juniper, and her deceased friend Athena, who is an incredibly successful author who's also Asian American of Chinese descent and is known for writing about fiction within the Asian diaspora. And Athena dies when she's 28, and she dies in the presence of Juniper, or June Hayward, who is also an author but isn't successful. And she just dies because they're eating pancakes, and she ends up they're having a pancake eating contest, and she ends up choking on the pancakes. And June is there, and they call an ambulance and stuff like that, but she ends up passing away because they can't do the Heimlich or whatever, and she dies at 28. But when she dies, she has a finished draft of a manuscript that she's been working on, and about Chinese laborers during World War I. And based on her writing process, Athena's writing process, no one really knows about this book. No one's seen it. No one's seen this draft. And she just showed June that night because she had just finished it. And so when she dies, and she also has no digital copies, nothing, just writes on a typewriter. So when she dies, June ends up taking that manuscript home and ends up submitting it to her publisher as her own work, editing it and revising it and publishing it under her own name. And what happens in the novel is basically people kind of find out about it or think that's happening, and we follow the fallout of that within the public eye from June's perspective. So what's really fascinating about how the author develops this narrative is that June has incredibly obvious and strong narcissistic tendencies, if not being a full-blown narcissist. And so she rewrites so much of her experience and her coming to this book throughout the novel to make herself the victim, to highlight her entitlement to this narrative. And what's really interesting about this is that it also gets used, these narcissistic tendencies are often used to highlight the similarities between narcissism and white supremacy and white entitlement, and this anger that June ultimately feels towards Athena because she is quote-unquote diverse and therefore given success within the literary industry because that's what's popular, that's what's in trend. And she ultimately feels like she's losing out on things she's entitled to as what she perceives to be a talented white author. And then so she kind of reworks her approach to this, her theft, throughout the novel, being I did as much work on this book as Athena did. This is my story. I'm owed this. And so you see this interesting revisionist history adopted throughout the book, which also highlights this white-focused mentality of I'm owed this. This is mine. I'm allowed to use non-white people as props and puppets in the curation of my own success. And while this is happening, the book is also goes through the traditional editorial mechanisms of being edited and published and all that kind of stuff. And so one of the really interesting things that happens here is that the publishers, the agents who are all white, end up fundamentally changing a lot of parts about Athena's original draft to cater to the white gaze, in which the main character June isn't attached to, because she didn't write it. It's not her stories. And I think this speaks to something that the author is ultimately doing with the book, which is that they're exposing or interrogating or highlighting, whatever word you want to use, the colonialization of knowledge and history and storytelling within Western societies. So in the case of June, we see that there's this white woman who feels entitled to the histories and stories of an Asian woman, and who also at the same time feels entitled to her work, can't create her own ideas. There's this common there's reoccurrence throughout this novel where she can't have her own inspirations. Like whenever she wants to write or feels moved to write, she's basically taking the ideas and the stories from other people, and most often those people are racialized and particularly Asian. And for me, that really gets at this idea that I've seen within Indigenous communities, particularly among Indigenous creatives, that white settlers and their descendants have no history. They have no real sense of belonging. They have created an entire community, culture, identity based on displacing Indigenous peoples and stealing from or exploiting or rendering abject Black and then other non-white people as well. And so they are actually left as these ghosts, these people without any kind of sense of belonging or home, because everything they know and they think comes from stealing the homes, the belonging, the identity, the culture, the ideas of other people. And then on the flip side, we see how the colonialization of knowledge, how the fact that people who own and dominate the media and knowledge creation and story manufacturing, the creation of the literary world, essentially, we see that, the fact that white people own and dominate these spaces, and they're propelled by their own anxiety about not having their own identity or history. We see the impact of that on non-white writers within the industry, particularly within the literary world, but within the world writ large, in which they get tokenized and forced to play the game, and they get reduced to certain, check boxes of identity based on a colonial mindset, and how oftentimes folks from these spaces, particularly a privileged position, will, they'll play into it, they'll use it for capitalist gain. So stories, again, even from non-white writers, get stolen in another way. They get repurposed for the white gaze, for this colonial idea that knowledge can be siloed based on certain identities, can be structured in a way where it's linear, where there's no messiness, there's only extraction for consumption, for production, for profit. And, non-white people aren't a multitude of things, they're just one thing. And that's, and then we often perpetuate that colonial thinking in order to have individual success. So all in all, this book, I'd say, is my new favorite book. It's tied with my already existing favorite book, which is The Last Word by Taylor Adams, which is also a book about perception and narcissism. But Yellowface is a book about that, but it's about that and so much more. It's honestly one of the most geniusly written things I've ever read, both in that it's captivating as hell and the pacing is great and you're just interested, but also just how smart it is and how much it uses perception and narration to explore the impacts of white supremacy in a multitude of ways on people's perception of reality and their telling of their stories. And then again, particularly with the literary industry, it's so fantastic. I did read Babel, which is the author's kind of big book, but I only read part of it. It's a really good book, but epics just aren't my thing. But this book, I consumed so quickly. I had to force myself to stop reading it because I was so engaged in it. I highly recommend it, and I think it's the kind of book that even if you're not attuned to literary analyses of racialization and white supremacy, you would still enjoy, because it's the main character, the narrator, is just someone you're so invested in, but in a way where it's you want to hate them, and then also has these fascinating and really on-point critiques about social media and the impact it has on publishing. There's a lot going on, and it's brought together so fantastically. Really recommend this book. So good. Incredibly happy I read it.